You made an interesting point. What would happen if at LAX we had this sort of a demonstration? We had Occupy here and was smashed in every city.
Sure.
So there's been, incredible restraint, at least on the part of the mainland government.
You could certainly make that point. In fact, I think that's irrefutable, that for all the draconian image associated with the mainland, and I'm not trying to in any way encourage an action more consistent with like what we saw here in the United States with Occupy, or maybe you've even seen with the yellow vest in France, where the gendarmes had to move in a very militaristic fashion and so forth. Nevertheless, you have, as a reality, in the face of these protests, which are unheard of course, in the mainland authorities, which under the Constitution and rule of law would be not only justified on that basis, but certainly compared to other governments around the world, it would seem protocol would suggest you send in the troops to deal with something when it gets this out of hand, and that has not happened.
Rob just came to California, so he was in Hong Kong a week ago. We have, before you, our 3 Hong Kong-based scholars ready to join. And I'd like to ask the 4 of you, but also Fiona, to talk about what's happening beyond the demonstrations. Because the pictures, the attention of the media is on those 1.7 or 2 million people gathered in various places. We have the video of the confrontations at the Legislative Council. We have video of the gangsters who beat protesters at the metro station, that sort of thing. But you folks live in Hong Kong. And so what's happening outside that? How are these protests bleeding into or not bleeding into everyday life?
Oh, okay. Beyond the protests, how do the protests affect the everyday life of Hong Kong people? Well, I think a few things. Okay, I think Samson and Robert obviously can chip in, but I guess for me, first of all, there has been kind of increasing kind of conflicts or polarization among the general public. So as a matter of fact, it has become more and more difficult for people holding different views to talk to each other. That occurs within families, that occurs within friend groups. I think, in fact, in our surveys, we have asked people in both June and September, we have actually asked people the extent to which the people they were talking to, they have been talking to, via Facebook, via WhatsApp, are having the same views, political views. In fact, the level of homogeneity of people's discussion network has increased very substantially between June and September. That is, people have increasingly avoided talking to people with of different points of views. And in fact, in the September survey, we have also asked people whether they are nowadays, worried that when they talk about the extradition bill and when they talk about the protest movements, whether they're worried that other peoples will overhear, and then maybe in the context of work, in the context of organizations, they might be reported because of the views. And in fact, actually 40 to 50% of the Hong Kong public said yes, they are kind of at least a little bit worried. And that worrying about discussing this kind of issues and being overheard actually exists regardless of people's political affiliation. That is, people who support the movement as well as people who do not support the movement are both kind of worried about on this situation. So I think even in the context of everyday life, meaningful discussions across the political divide has become more and more difficult. And I think this will be one of the things that I think can be highlighted.
So the polarization that you're talking about, people are, through self-censorship and controlling their own comments, participating in creating, real-life filter bubbles. Do you agree with that, Robert, Samson? Do you gentlemen agree with what Francis has said?
Maybe I have just a 4 observations to share. One is, I think it's verified by all the survey data that we all have. Hong Kong society is being polarized more and more. So we have talking about blue cam versus yellow cam, and then we are now talking about deep blue versus deep yellow. So this polarization actually splits the society across almost all fronts, all professions. And on that issue, because we are seeing, this is a media class, of course, we are also seeing a great divide in the media consumption behavior of the ordinary people. Now, seems that people have lost trust in most of the so-called traditional media in Hong Kong. So many people, including those senior people, are now going to the social media directly or as reported by other young people. So that is a development along the media consumption front. And the third and probably the fourth point is important in that we are now stepping into the election period in Hong Kong. So we'll be having the so-called district council, the so-called grassroots level election very soon, in 2 months' time. And then next year will be the legislative election. So it seems that the protesters and probably the anti-protesters are really gearing themselves up for the 2 elections to come. So I would think that issues like constitutional reform, like the popular 4 or 5 demands against the the extradition bill will stay, and they will proceed to become an issue of the political campaigning for the elections. That's my point. I'm not quite sure the mic is fixed or not, but I hope you can hear me clear now.
You may not be able to hear us, but we heard you loud and clear. Samson, would you like to comment?
I think the very disruptive and violent scenes on the TV is actually a little bit exaggerated of the situation in Hong Kong. I think everyday life is still quite normal, I must say. It's interesting that there is usually a rhythm. Weekdays would be perfectly fine, and I don't think there's a lot of disruption going on in Hong Kong. But usually weekends will be a little bit more problematic. But of course, the media, the violent scenes are always being repeated recurrently on the media. So it seems like Hong Kong is very, very disruptive at the moment. But actually, things are okay. I also want to add a point about polarization. I certainly agree with Francis and Robert that Hong Kong society is increasingly polarized. But at the same time, I think in the work environment, there is also increasing fear that certain political stance might be, might result in, being fired. As we can see recently in the case of Cathay Pacific, there has been a lot of people who supported protests who lost their jobs. So I think this is a very worrying situation in Hong Kong, and people cannot express their political opinion very freely in the work environment. There's also another aspect. It's that people have fear of going back to mainland China. People in Hong Kong, because a lot of people, when they cross the border, they have their phones checked, and they will be questioned for a pretty long time. So I think that is also quite damaging to the city. A lot of people are not, they fear of going back to China either for business or for visiting their relatives or just for fun. So I think these are all changing. These are very much very different from the past.
So when I was looking at your slides, what kind of struck me was exactly what Clay brought up, that the anger was more directed at the Hong Kong government as opposed to the Beijing government. And I'm wondering why, because my understanding is that there is a very kind of firm sense that the Hong Kong government, because of the history of election happening in that city, it's a little bit of a mouthpiece of the Chinese government. So I'm wondering why the anger is not directed at China more.
Well, I think at least my personal opinion, my personal observation is that one of the things that have been occurring throughout the movement is, I would call, actually, I think Samson brought up the term, radicalization with self-restraint, collective restraint. There has been a strong sense of constraint restraint. Okay, so from the perspective of Hong Kong people, they might feel that the protesters and the Hong Kong public might feel that directly targeting at the Chinese government is probably not necessarily the best strategic option. After all, supposedly, even though, and you are perfectly right, I mean, people actually understand that the Chinese government was behind controlling things. But at least on the surface, the SAR government, Carrie Lam, is still the head of, still the chief executive of Hong Kong. So I think the Hong Kong people and the protesters are targeting mainly at the Hong Kong government because they want to, just push the Hong Kong government to actually do its job properly. Because this is also basically, I think from the citizens' perspective, from the protesters' perspective, this is also on their basic goal. The basic goal is not to look for independent Hong Kong. The basic goal is to maintain or to repair, so to speak, one country, two systems. And if you want one country, two systems to work, then you need the Hong Kong government to do things. Right? If you directly target the Chinese government and then the Chinese government respond, this is still not one country, two systems. This is actually beyond that. So I think there is a kind of a logic, both strategic and substantive, behind why protesters and why Hong Kong people still tend to focus on targeting the Hong Kong government instead of directly at the Chinese government.
Robert,
well, maybe I could put forward an analogy. One country, two system acts like a firewall. So people within the firewall, that means Hong Kong people, the liberal world, are very much worried about what beyond the firewall. So in mainland China, there's not so much freedom, the rule of law is not there. So if we have a very nice firewall, then we could survive. But now somebody is tearing down the firewall. So do you blame the person who tear down the firewall, or do you blame those people behind the firewall who is not quite like you? So it seems that the issue of extradition bill is the kind of a very technical an issue that one country, two system is breaking down. So who is to be blamed for that? So most people thought, well, the chief executive, as representing Hong Kong people, should be there to really make the firewall intact. But now it's collapsing. So Chinese officials would be worried that the anger amongst people now in Hong Kong against the local government would spread to the mainland, or even affect the younger generation back in mainland China. So that is the reason why there's such a tension amongst the various parties. I mean, central governments, and then represented by the establishment group in Hong Kong, and also the local government, and then the common people itself.
Yeah, I just want to add on Francis and Robert. I think it's a strategic move not to target the Beijing authorities, and I think Hong Kongers actually know. I think know that Beijing has a lot of control behind the scene over the Hong Kong government, but then Hong Kongers also know that to directly lobby the Beijing government is not very useful, because you should direct at people who are closer to you, to the Hong Kong government, and that's a smarter strategic choice. And another factor is a matter of political culture. I don't think Hong Kongers have been very involved in national politics in China, even though we are under one country, two systems. For instance, the Hong Kong government doesn't pay any tax to the Chinese government, to the central government. So we're still there's institutional firewall between the two governments. So Hong Kongers are never really used to participating in national politics. So that's why I think the target of the blame is on the local authorities rather than on the Beijing government.
Many of us from outside Hong Kong have to suspect that the gross inequality that's present in Hong Kong, that you would that Hong Kong has such an affordability crisis in terms of housing. We here in Los Angeles find housing hard to afford, and it's twice as difficult to do so in Hong Kong.
3 times.
Okay, our chief economist points out that I'm underestimating. 3 times as unaffordable as Los Angeles. And so one of the striking things is how much of that performance evaluation for Carrie Lam or for the Hong Kong government in general, the low opinion that people seem to have of the Hong Kong government, how much is that is a response to a feeling that the Hong Kong government is not addressing a central economic question? The inequality and the affordability, the question about opportunities, expanding opportunities for young people in Hong Kong. The surveys don't touch on any of that. And I'm curious if that is a fundamental level of anxiety that then makes any little thing a much bigger catalyst than it otherwise might be. We have Fiona who's back, Rob who lives in Hong Kong, and we have the 3 of you. Could you talk about whether or not economic issues are at play at all?
I think for me, the important thing is that there are, behind the economic problems, there are more fundamental structural problems. So the economic issues, I believe, for Hong Kong people are not just economic issues. What does that mean? Now, of course, the high property prices, Hong Kong is notorious for that. But I guess for a lot of Hong Kong people, it's not just the fact that the property prices are unaffordable. It's also the general perception or general understanding that what caused this to happen, what made this problem to persist for so long or to just aggravate over the years without any redress, is a very fundamental problem of, in local language, we used to talk about the hegemony of the property developers. We used to talk about the collusion between the government officials and the business people. And in the past 2 or 3 years, in local parlance, we have extended that collusion to include officials, business people, rural forces, and gangsters. Okay, so there is in local discourse, in local public opinion, there is this general perception that there is this collusion of power, okay, among different forces that were behind, these socioeconomic problems. So in one sense, you can say, yes, the socioeconomic problems are part of the bigger picture, but I think it's not just socioeconomic problems. It's what are the underlying structural issues regarding the distribution of power, regarding the how, what kind of forces are actually governing Hong Kong. What kind of forces are actually kind of controlling the Hong Kong government? I think it's this kind of questions and perceptions that are really underlying people's very strong discontent. And that's also explained why, in the end, for this protest movement, the ultimate goal is still returning to democratization. It's still returning to resolving the structural issues underlying various kinds of socioeconomic and political problems.
So focusing on that accountability question, having a government that's more responsive to popular will. I don't know if the others would like to comment on economic questions.
I do wonder, as I think it's interesting that, as a matter of course, the presentation that you gave already take into account economics as an underlying issue, which when I talk to my families and friends in Hong Kong, we're talking about middle class people who cannot get flats, right? But I'm also wondering,
even upper class. I mean,
upper
what would be considered lower upper class here, you can't afford a very small apartment in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, as people here, because I look at media from Hong Kong and also from here. But I am wondering, like a Western audience, whether that kind of forces, do you feel like it's being adequately kind of reported on in the Western media's portrayal of the protests in Hong Kong? I'm not sure, so I'm just kind of wondering. Do you see that, Clay?
Well, I think we can't have enough reporting. And there has been some reporting on these economic issues, but it's now, these days, most focused on the US-China macro question and the role that Hong Kong plays in that mix. But let's hear from the others. I don't know if you care to comment on that.
Yes, maybe I could share a bit of observations from our survey findings in the past. I think over a decade or so, periodically, especially during those June 4th periods, we asked people of Hong Kong, do you think that economic development is more important than a democratic development, both for Hong Kong and also China? In very recent years, we have been seeing a growing kind of concern amongst Hong Kong people in general for political development across the border. So this brings to always this the dilemma of what is actually the underlying factor, economic or so-called socio-political problem. I tend to look at it in this way. The economic and so-called social livelihood issues in Hong Kong has been there, and it has been a problem. Land pricing and housing has always been a problem. But the problem has been existing for quite some time. And of course, many people are trying to tackle it. It didn't really get so much worse over the past couple of months. We are seeing all these trade war between the States and China, of course, that affected the economy of Hong Kong as well. But the very big plunge in people's self-satisfaction and also trust in everything has to do with the socio-political changes recently. So what I mean is that if we control the economic factor stable, then we could see that all these ups and downs in the history of Hong Kong and also in China, and I like to pinpoint a couple of very, very important years, that they are really socio-politically driven. Now, this year is 2019, of course. This is a 100-year and centenary of the May 4th movement. And you look back at May 4th, where basically the students then, 100 years ago in China, were demanding for democracy and also science. Now, in 1949, we have the New China established. So that was exactly 30 years after the May 4th movement. And it ended with a 9 as well, 1949. And we know it's such a big change in China. Then, of course, in 1989, again, and with the 9, that was the Tiananmen incident. And that incident had a big impact in China and also in Hong Kong, amongst Hong Kong people, of my generation at least. So all these events happened sort of cyclically, periodically, once every 20, 30 years as a big event. So we could not just explain all these events by economic development, because there are times when the economy grows to such a time, whether it's a good or bad side, people turn to the thinking of freedom, to the thinking of democracy, political issues. So I think what we are seeing in Hong Kong right now actually is a political crisis.
I agree with Francis and Robert. I think if you look at the history of social movements in Hong Kong, none of them is really about the economy. Most of them are about politics. And even back in 2003, when the economy was very bad, the protest was primarily motivated by the national security legislation. And then after that, you also see, for instance, the anti-national education movement in 2012. And in 2014, the umbrella movement. All of these are driven by political factors. We have been actually doing similar kinds of survey on the streets and in many protests. So when we speak with the protestors, they really insist that the reason they're there is not because they couldn't afford an apartment. Even if they could afford an apartment, they will still be protesting on the streets. So that's why if you look at the data, one side I showed in my slides is that there is a fair mix of middle class and lower class participants. 51% are middle class. We also, in later surveys, we also added the question about asset ownership. So a lot of people who have assets, who have properties, they still went to the streets to protest against the government. So I think socioeconomic factors is definitely a few to the protest, but it's not the major reason. It is politics. It is the dissatisfaction against the government that comes to all together into political grievances.